The Klaxons
Day
did not scream.
473. We've
They
charted
bled
the
into
anomaly,
air,
but
dull
reserves are at
rhythmic
12%.
That rattled the
threat.
teeth and turned the stomach.
Initiating Thorn's Gambit.
Red emergency
Monitor all
lighting washed
frequencies.
over the bridge of the
Affirmative,
USSC
Captain. Systems engaged.
Pioneer like dried blood. Sparks rained from the primary ventilation shafts, hissing against the cold steel deck. Commander Alara Thorne gripped the edge of the tactical console. Her knuckles were white. Her breathing was
Status
shallow.
report! Vitals
She
are weak.
tasted
Patching
copper
now.
and ash.
Rerouting power. Keep them
Deep in the
stable.
bowels of
Copy.
the
Almost there.
exploration vessel, the main reactor was dying. It wasn't a clean death. It was a slow, agonizing meltdown, hemorrhaging lethal doses of gamma radiation into the ship's life support systems. Engineering, Alara said. Her voice was steady. It had to be. Give it to me straight. Static crackled over the comms, followed by a wet, heavy cough. Containment is gone, Commander. The shielding cracked 3 minutes ago. We have maybe 6 hours before the ambient radiation cooks us from the inside out. Life support is pulling toxic air. I cannot fix it, ma'am. I am sorry. Alara closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She thought of her son back on Earth, 10 years old, a quiet boy who loved looking through telescopes. She had promised him she would come back. A commander of the United States Space Command did not break her promises. But out here in the uncharted black, promises meant nothing to the void. They were 3 weeks from the nearest relay station. The Pioneer was a speck of dust in an ocean of absolute zero. They had cast their distress beacon into the abyss, a desperate flare fired into an empty night. She opened her eyes and looked at her crew. 11 faces stared back at her through the crimson gloom. 11 good men and women, navigators, mechanics, scientists. They were United States military and civilian contractors. They were disciplined. They didn't weep and they didn't panic, but she saw the profound quiet terror settling behind their eyes. Lieutenant Miller was already clutching his stomach, his skin taking on a sickly, translucent pallor. The radiation was fast. Keep the beacon broadcasting on all frequencies, Alara ordered him, forcing steel into her spine. Divert all remaining auxiliary power to the signal array. We hold the line. We don't quit. They nodded. They went back to their dying consoles. But Alara knew the truth. They were going to die out here cold and alone. The silence of deep space was already wrapping around them, preparing a tomb. Hours bled away. The air grew thick, tasting of old tin and ozone. The temperature plummeted as the ship's internal heaters failed. The silence on the bridge was broken only by the ragged breathing of dying sailors. Miller had collapsed an hour ago, blood weeping from his nose and ears. Alara sat in the center chair, her vision blurring, a deep gnawing ache settling into her marrow. She pulled a small silver recorder from her tactical vest. Her fingers felt like lead. She pressed the activation rune. If anyone ever found this drifting coffin, they needed to know how the crew of the Pioneer faced the end. Commander's log. She began, her voice a fragile rasp. Commander. The voice came from the navigation officer. It wasn't panicked. It was utterly breathless. Alara forced her head up. Report. Shadow on the sensors. Massive. Dropping out of faster-than-light travel. It is right on top of us. Alara dragged herself up from the chair. She leaned heavily against the viewport. Through the frost-rimed glass, the endless void of space was eclipsed by a leviathan. It was a ship, but unlike anything built in the shipyards of Earth. It was an organic masterpiece of sweeping curves and iridescent plating, glowing with a soft, bioluminescent blue light. It looked less like a machine and more like an apex predator of the deep ocean, majestic and terrifying. It dwarfed the Pioneer. It was silent. It was alien. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the haze of Alara's radiation sickness. Humanity had only encountered the fringes of alien intelligence, and the history was written in blood. A ship that size could vaporize the Pioneer without breaking stride. A transmission forced its way through the Pioneer's dying comm system. The translation matrix worked furiously, converting clicking resonant alien tones into harsh English. Human vessel. This is the Valkyrie orbital cruiser Star Treader. Your hull is compromised. You are venting lethal radiation. Do you require assistance? Alara gripping the comms module. Yes, God. Yes, USSC, Pioneer. We have 12 souls aboard. Critical radiation poisoning. We are dying. A heavy, agonizing pause stretched across the frequency. Our laws are absolute. The alien voice replied, sounding heavy with sorrow. The Valkyrie High Council forbids interference with unaligned species. To board your vessel is to break the Prime Edict. We are observers. Only observers. Ilara felt the last ember of hope turn to ash in her chest. They had come to watch them die. Listen to me, Ilara breathed into the mic, her voice cracking. I have young men and women dying on this deck. If your laws tell you to watch children choke on their own blood, then your laws are broken. Please, silence. The blue lights of the Leviathan pulsed slowly in the dark. On the bridge of the Valkyrie ship, Captain Kalen stood before his main viewing screen. He was an ancient being by human standards nearing his 9th decade. His skin was a mosaic of deep green scales, his eyes large golden and slitted. He was a creature of profound intellect and absolute discipline. He had served the Valkyrie fleet for 50 years. He knew the Prime Edict. To break it was treason. To break it was to lose his command, his pension, his honor, and his freedom. He looked at the thermal scans of the small, primitive human ship. He saw the 12 tiny heat signatures fading, winking out one by one like dying candles in a winter storm. He thought of the High Council. He thought of the cold, sterile halls of Valkyrie Prime, where politicians debated the morality of the universe, while sitting safely behind heavily armed orbital defense grids. Kalen turned to his first officer. The young Valkyrie's scales were pale with anxiety. Captain, the officer whispered, if we deploy the docking tether, the Council will know. The telemetry is automatically logged. You will be stripped of rank. Kalen looked back at the dying human ship. A law that demands the death of the innocent is not a law. It is an excuse for cowardice. Kalen straightened his heavy uniform. Extend the docking tether. Prepare the medical bays for extreme trauma. We are going in. The next 3 hours were a blur of visceral chaos. Ilara remembered the violent clang of the magnetic locks engaging. She remembered the airlock grinding open, not with hostile fire, but with a rush of clean, pure oxygen. She saw them then. Towering reptilian figures in environmental suits moving with astonishing speed and terrifying gentleness. They didn't speak. They simply moved into the radioactive hell of the Pioneer, lifting the dying human sailors into their arms like fragile glass dolls. Ilara tried to walk, but her legs gave out. She felt thick, scaled hands catch her before she hit the deck. She looked up into the golden eyes of Captain Kalen through his visor. You are safe, Commander, the alien said. The translator clipped to his chest made the words sound mechanical, but the tone beneath it was undeniably warm. We have you. The Valkyrie medical bay was a sanctuary of blinding white light and humming machinery. The humans were stripped of their contaminated gear and submerged in gelatinous anti-radiation suspension pods. The Valkyrie doctors worked frantically. Human physiology was entirely alien to them. They were improvising, pumping synthetic blood expanders and cellular regenerators into the veins of the dying sailors. It was brutal. It was terrifying. But it was life. Ilara lay on a diagnostic bed, an IV line, thick as her thumb, feeding cool liquid into her arm. The bone-deep ache of the radiation was receding, leaving behind an exhaustion so profound she felt hollowed out. Captain Kalen stood at the foot of her bed. He had removed his environmental helmet. He looked tired. Your crew will survive, Kalen said quietly. All 12. The cellular damage has been halted. Your ship has been scrubbed and the reactor temporarily patched. You will be able to make the journey back to your space. Ilara stared at him. You said it was against your laws. You said you were forbidden. Kalen's reptilian features shifted, a subtle tightening of the scales around his eyes that Ilara interpreted as a sad smile. It is. When I return to Valkyrie Prime, I will be placed under arrest. I will face a tribunal. I will lose my ship. Ilara pushed herself up on her elbows. The IV line pulled taut. Why? Why would you destroy your own life for strangers? Because you were dying, Kalen stated, as if it were the simplest mathematical equation in the universe. Honor is not found in the pages of a law book, Commander Thorne. It is found in the choices we make when the shadows close in. My crew voted. We chose to be honorable. Ilara sank back onto the medical bed. She looked at the ceiling, trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. An alien commander had just sacrificed his entire legacy to save 12 foreign sailors. He had thrown away his life so she could go home and see her son. She reached into the pocket of her scrubbed uniform jacket sitting on the tray beside her. She pulled out the silver recorder. She looked at Kalen. Her eyes were hard-burning with a fierce, uncompromising fire. "Captain Kalen," she said, "I need you to listen to me. Humans are a flawed species. We are violent. We are arrogant. We make mistakes. But we have one defining trait, one thing that forms the bedrock of our entire civilization." She pressed the recording rune. "We pay our debts." She spoke into the device, her voice echoing in the quiet alien medical bay. "I am Commander Alara Thorne of the United States Space Command. Today, Captain Kalen of the Valkyrie fleet sacrificed his honor and his freedom to save 12 American lives. He asked for nothing. He expected nothing. But a debt has been incurred." She finished recording and held the small, silver cylinder out to the towering alien. "Take this," Alara commanded. Kalen looked at the device confused. "I do not require a token of gratitude, Commander." "It is not a token," Alara said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "It is a promissory note. You keep this. You hide it. I do not care if it takes a week, a year, or a century. If your people are ever backed against a wall, if you are ever facing the end and you have nowhere left to turn, you send this frequency, you send this voice." Kalen took the small silver cylinder. It looked absurdly small in his massive scaled hand. "You do not understand the galaxy, Commander," Kalen said gently. "Empires rise and fall. Promises fade. The Valkyrie do not carry debts across the stars." "We do," Alara said, never breaking eye contact. "Humanity remembers. You call us captain, and we will come." They parted ways in the silent black. The Pioneer limped back toward the Sol system. The Star Treader turned back toward Valkyrie space. When Captain Kalen stepped off his ship onto his homeworld, he was immediately surrounded by armed planetary guards. They stripped him of his rank insignia. They took his sidearm. They marched him through the capital city in disgrace. He was labeled a rogue, a liability, a criminal who endangered the isolationist purity of the Valkyrie people. He was banished to the lower sectors of the capital, forced to live out his remaining days in obscurity and shame. But beneath his rough-spun tunic, pressed tightly against his scales, he kept the small silver cylinder. Sometimes in the deep quiet of the night, he would look at it. He didn't believe the human woman. He knew the universe was a cold, indifferent place. Species did not remember favors. Survival was the only law. But he kept it, because it was the only piece of honor he had left. 40 years passed. The universe moved on. Empires expanded. Stars died. In the orbital shipyards high above Earth, the United States Space Command had grown into a formidable presence. Humanity was no longer a fragile species venturing into the unknown in tin cans. They had built fleets of titanium and depleted uranium. They had mapped the local cluster. Aboard the super dreadnought USS Alamo, Admiral Gideon Thorne stood before the massive panoramic viewport of his ready room. He was a man carved from granite and weathered by relentless storms. At 50, his hair was heavily salted with gray, cropped in a strict military fade. The lines around his eyes were deep etched by decades of staring into the harsh glare of tactical displays and making decisions that cost lives. He wore the dark blue uniform of the fleet, the chest heavy with ribbons of valor, but he carried them with a quiet, burdensome weight. He held a mug of black coffee, the ceramic chipped at the rim. The coffee was terrible, brewed in the engine room's mess hall exactly the way he liked it. It tasted like engine oil and wakefulness. Gideon looked down at Earth, a brilliant marble of blue and white swirling in the black. "Admiral," the voice of his flag lieutenant, a young man named explicitly for his sharp mind and lack of hesitation, who broke the silence. "Well, go ahead, Lieutenant," Gideon said, not turning away from the window. "The fleet inspection is complete, sir. The 3rd and 5th carrier strike groups are fueled and awaiting deployment orders to the outer colonies. Munitions are at 98% capacity. Make it 100% before they detach," Gideon replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I do not send American ships into the void with empty chambers." "Yes, sir." The lieutenant hesitated. "Sir, it is the anniversary today. I have the archive files queued up if you wish to review them." Gideon tightened his grip on the coffee mug. It had been 10 years since his mother, Alara Thorne, had passed away. But today was not the anniversary of her death. Today was the 40th anniversary of the day the Pioneer went dark, the day she was supposed to die. Gideon walked over to his massive oak desk, a piece of actual wood he had insisted on having bolted to the deck of the dreadnought. He tapped the glass surface. A holographic projection flared to life, showing a rudimentary star map 4 decades old. It showed a path into uncharted space. He remembered being a boy, 10 years old, watching his mother pack her duffel bag. He remembered the smell of her uniform, the crisp snap of her salute. He remembered the terror of the 6 months she was missing in action, the empty chair at the dinner table, the solemn faces of Navy officers visiting the house. And he remembered the day she came back. She had been thinner, her hair graying prematurely from the radiation trauma, but her eyes had possessed a terrifying, uncompromising clarity. She had sat him down and told him a story about monsters in the dark and the giant green-scaled angel who had thrown away his own life to pull her from the fire. "Never forget what we are, Gideon," she had told him, her grip on his small shoulder almost painful. "Politicians will tell you the uniform is about power. Generals will tell you it is about strategy. They are wrong. The uniform is a promise. It means we stand between the innocent and the monsters. And it means we never ever forget a debt." Gideon drank the bitter coffee. "Leave the files closed, Lieutenant. I do not need the archives to remember." "Yes, Admiral." Gideon looked back at the stars. He was a creature of routine, of a discipline, of cold, hard military logic. But deep in his chest, beneath the metals in the titanium armor of his ship, he carried the ghost of an alien he had never met. An alien who had given up everything so that a 10-year-old boy could have his mother back. He wondered, as he did every year on this day, if Captain Kalin was still alive. He wondered if the Valkyrie even remembered the humans they had saved. Millions of light years away, the Valkyrie were not thinking of humans. They were only thinking of how to survive the next 10 seconds. The sky above Valkyrie Prime was no longer a serene bioluminescent blue. It was a churning, violent inferno of apocalyptic orange and sickly toxic purple. The Krell Empire had not declared war. They did not issue demands. The Krell did not negotiate with species they considered prey. They simply arrived. A massive armada of jagged, heavily armored warships resembling floating iron fortresses had dropped out of hyperspace directly over the Valkyrie homeworld. Without a single transmission, they had opened fire. Orbital defense platforms designed for asteroid deflection and light policing were vaporized in the first volley. The Krell used plasma-phased weaponry that burned hotter than a star's core. On the surface, the capital city was a slaughterhouse. Zyra ran. She was young for a Valkyrie, her scales a bright, vibrant emerald, but right now they were coated in ash and the blue blood of her neighbors. She scrambled over the shattered remains of a crystalline spire that had once been an academy of philosophy. Now it was a tomb. Above her, a Krell gunship roared past its engines, screaming like a dying animal. A beam of concentrated plasma struck the street a block away. The shockwave picked Zyra up and threw her against a stone wall. The air was sucked from her lungs. She tasted dirt and ozone. She forced herself up. She had to keep moving. The lower sectors, the slums, the Valkyrie were a peaceful race. They were scholars, diplomats, artists. They had spent 1,000 years perfecting the art of non-interference. They had isolated themselves behind an ideology of absolute neutrality, and now they were being butchered for it. The Krell ground troops were already landing. Massive, brutish warriors clad in thick, blackened armor, wielding thermal lances that sliced through Valkyrie civilians like wet paper. There was no resistance. It was an extermination. Zyra limped through the burning alleys of the lower sector. The heat was unbearable. Buildings were collapsing around her, sending plumes of thick black smoke into the choking sky. She reached a reinforced blast door hidden behind a mound of refuse. She slammed her fist against the access panel, overriding the primitive security lock. The door hissed open and she stumbled into the dark, damp bunker. "Grandfather," Ira gasped, falling to her arms on the cold floor. In the corner of the dim room, illuminated only by a flickering emergency light, sat Kalin. He was incredibly old now. His scales had faded to a dull, dusty gray. His eyes, once bright gold, were clouded with cataracts. He leaned heavily on a wooden cane. He had lived in this squalor for 40 years, an exile in his own world. He looked at his granddaughter, taking in her bruised, bleeding form, and the distant, rhythmic thud of orbital bombardments shaking the bunker walls. "They have broken the outer lines," Kalen said. His voice was fragile, dry as dead leaves. "The Krell. They are killing everyone," Zyra sobbed, grabbing his arm. "The High Council is dead. The fleet is gone. The civilian transports are trying to launch from the northern spaceport, but the Krell have locked down the orbit. They are just shooting the colony ships out of the sky. Grandfather, we are going to be extinct." Kalen closed his eyes. He felt the vibrations of his dying world traveling up through the floorboards into his bones. His people had prioritized law over morality, neutrality over strength, and this was the harvest. "There is an old communication relay," Kalen said slowly, "beneath this sector, a deep space transmitter abandoned since the unification wars. It still has power from the geothermal taps." Zyra looked at him desperately. "Transmit to who? We have no allies. We obeyed the Prime Edict. We helped no one, and now no one will help us. The galaxy is watching us burn." Kalen reached a trembling hand beneath his rough tunic. He fumbled with a leather cord tied around his neck. He pulled it free. A small silver cylinder, tarnished by 40 years of sweat in exile but still intact. "40 years ago," Kalen whispered, staring at the metal tube, "I broke the law. I pulled 12 drowning creatures from the fire. They were primitive. They were violent. But their leader, she had eyes like a dying star." He pressed the cylinder into Zyra's shaking, blood-stained hands. "She told me a lie." Kalen said, a bitter, sad smile touching his lips. "She said her people remember. She said they pay their debts across the stars. It is the arrogance of a young species to believe in such things, but it is the only thing we have left." Zyra stared at the human device. "Humans' grandfather Earth is on the other side of the sector. Even if they hear us, the Krell will annihilate them. Why would they come for 12 lays 4 decades ago?" "They will not," Kalen said softly. "But you must try, Zyra. Take it to the relay. Patch the audio through the deep space transmitter. Broadcast it on all human frequencies. Then get to the northern spaceport. Try to find a ship. I will not leave you. I am a ghost child. I died 40 years ago when they took my ship." Kalen pushed her toward the door. "Go. Run." Zyra looked at her grandfather one last time, a frail titan in the ruins of a broken world. She gripped the silver cylinder, turned, and ran back out into the fire. The journey to the underground relay was a nightmare of evasion and terror. Zyra scrambled through subterranean maintenance shafts while the city above her was systematically reduced to slag. She could hear the screams of her people echoing down the ventilation pipes, a chorus of absolute despair. She reached the relay station. It was a massive, antiquated cavern of humming generators and towering antenna arrays. She broke into the control booth. Her hands flew across the dusty consoles, bypassing decayed security protocols and forcing the geothermal reserves to route power to the main transmitter array. The machinery groaned, protesting decades of neglect, but the massive dishes deep underground began to align. She connected the silver cylinder to the audio input port. She engaged the transmission sequence, directing the tight beam pulse toward the spatial coordinates of the Sol system. "This is Valkyrie Prime!" Zyra screamed into the comms channel, her voice breaking tears, cutting clean lines through the soot on her face. "The Krell Empire is exterminating our species. We have no military. We have no hope. We are dying." She activated the playback on the silver cylinder. Through the static of the deep space channel, a voice cut through. It was female. It was human. It was 40 years old, but it rang with absolute terrifying authority. "Captain Kalen of the Valkyrie fleet sacrificed his honor and his freedom to save 12 American lives. He asked for nothing. He expected nothing. But a debt has been incurred. Humanity remembers. You call us captain, and we will come." Zyra hit the master broadcast switch. The massive antenna array discharged, sending the signal tearing through the fabric of hyperspace, a desperate message in a bottle cast into a burning sea. A split second later, the roof of the cavern collapsed. A Krell bunker buster munition had penetrated the subterranean level. Concrete and steel rained down. The shockwave threw Zyra across the room, slamming her into a bulkhead. The world went black, filled only with the deafening roar of destruction. The transmission was cut. The relay was dead. On the surface of Valkyrie Prime, the Krell warships moved into position over the northern spaceport. Below them, thousands of Valkyrie refugees were packing into fragile, unarmed colony ships desperate to flee. Aboard the Krell Command Dreadnought, Warlord Morvath stood on his bridge, a massive armored brute radiating malice. He looked down at the pathetic scramble of the Valkyrie ships. "They are attempting to launch," his tactical officer sneered. "Let them lift off," Morvath rumbled, a cruel, jagged smile revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. "Let them feel the hope of the squee, then arm the magnetic disruption mines, seal the orbital perimeter. When they hit the upper atmosphere, burn them all. Leave no survivors. This sector belongs to the Krell." The Valkyrie were alone. The trap was set. The execution was imminent. But across the galaxy in the cold, silent orbit of Earth, a console on the bridge of the USSC Alamo began to blink. A low-frequency ping, an obsolete decryption code, a voice from the grave. The console on the bridge of the United States Space Command Dreadnought. Alamo did not scream. It blinked. A solitary rhythmic pulse of amber light cutting through the dim tactical gloom of the command deck. Admiral Gideon Thorne stood over the communication station. His massive hands rested on the titanium bulkhead. He listened to the static. He listened to the weeping of an alien girl he had never met, separated from him by millions of light years. And then he heard the ghost. His mother's voice, 40 years old, preserved in digital amber, echoed across the quiet bridge. Her words were a hammer striking the anvil of his memory. He asked for nothing. He expected nothing. But a debt has been incurred. Humanity remembers. "You call us, Captain, and we will come." The transmission looped. The silence on the Alamo was absolute. Every officer on the deck had stopped breathing. They looked at the console, and then they looked at the broad, immovable back of their admiral. Gideon did not flinch. He did not weep. He reached out with a scarred finger and tapped the comms array. "Route this to the Pentagon," he ordered. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble. "Secure channel, priority 1. Wake up the Secretary of Defense." The screen flickered, shifting from the tactical map of the Sol system to the sterile, hyperlit confines of the Pentagon's deepest subterranean war room. The men in the room were not warriors. They were politicians who wore suits that cost more than a Marine's combat armor. They dealt in risk assessments, profit margins, and geopolitical leverage. At the head of the table sat Secretary of Defense Vance. He looked irritated. He looked at his watch. "Admiral Thorne," Vance said, his voice clipped and smooth. "It is 3 a.m. in Washington. I hope this is an extinction-level event." Gideon played the transmission. He let the screams of Valkyrie Prime fill the sterile room. He let the cracking, desperate voice of Zyra paint the walls with the blood of a dying world. He let his mother's promise hang in the air like a drawn sword. The audio finished. The silence returned. Vance adjusted his cuffs. He looked at a data slate handed to him by a nervous aide. "A tragedy," Vance said. His tone was as dry as desert dust. "The intelligence boys have been tracking the Krell movements for months. They are an apex predator species, highly aggressive, expanding their borders. It appears the Valkyrie were foolish enough to build their civilization in the path of a storm." "They are being exterminated," Gideon said. The words tasted like iron in his mouth. "They are not our allies, Admiral," Vance countered, leaning forward. "The Valkyrie are an isolationist species. We have no treaties with them. We have no trade agreements. We have zero strategic interest in that sector. It is a dead zone." 40 years ago, Gideon said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming something that made the junior officers on his bridge take a step back. 40 years ago, a Valkyrie captain broke his own world's laws to pull my mother out of a radioactive fire. He saved 12 American lives. He gave up his command and his honor to do it. My mother gave him her word. She gave him the word of the United States." Vance sighed. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I respect your mother's legacy, Gideon. I truly do. She was a fine officer, but she was a ship captain, not a diplomat. She had no authority to bind the United States military to a blood oath with a race of green-skinned pacifists." "They are dying, Arthur," Gideon said, using the secretary's first name. "And I feel terrible for him," Vance snapped, losing his composure. "But I am not sending the Pacific and Atlantic fleets into a meat grinder against the Krell Empire to pay off a sentimental debt from the history books. Do you know the tonnage of a Krell dreadnought? Do you know the thermal output of their plasma batteries? It would be a slaughter. We would be risking American lives for nothing. Not for nothing, Gideon said quietly. For our soul, for the right to look at ourselves in the mirror. This is a strategic briefing, Admiral, not a Sunday sermon, Vance barked. You are ordered to stand down. All United States vessels are restricted from entering the Valkyrie sector. Any ship that crosses that line will be considered rogue. Any officer who commands it will be court-martialed for treason. We are locking the border. We are staying out of this. Is that understood, Admiral? Gideon Thorne looked at the holographic projection of the Secretary of Defense. He looked at the other men in the room. Men who had never smelled burning ozone, who had never written a letter to a grieving mother. Gideon reached up to his collar. His fingers found the silver stars pinned to his lapel, the stars he had bled for, the stars he had dedicated 30 years of his life to earn. He unclasped the left star. He unclasped the right star. He placed them on the titanium console. The metal clinked against the deck, a small, sharp sound that echoed louder than artillery fire. What are you doing, Thorne? Vance demanded, his face flushing red. I am retiring from politics, Gideon said. He reached out and severed the connection. The screen went black. The bridge of the Alamo was dead silent. The officers stared at the two silver stars resting on the console. They knew what their admiral had just done. He had just thrown away his career. He had just made himself a criminal. Gideon turned around. He looked at his flag lieutenant. The young man was pale, his hands shaking slightly at his sides. Lieutenant, Gideon said. His voice was no longer a rumble. It was clear. It was precise. It was the voice of a man who had finally found the battle he was meant to fight. Yes, Admiral? Access the master communications frame, Gideon ordered. I want you to bypass the Pentagon encryption walls. I want you to initiate the Nightingale Protocol. The lieutenant stopped breathing. Sir, the Nightingale Protocol, that is an absolute emergency override. It is designed for the total collapse of the command structure. It connects directly to the transponder of every ship carrying an American registration. Military, civilian, commercial, everything. I know what it does, son, Gideon said. Open the line. The lieutenant did not hesitate. He turned to his console. His fingers flew across the glass interface. Warnings flashed red across the screens. Unauthorized access. Security breach. He bypassed them all. He broke the seals. Protocol activated, sir, the lieutenant said, his voice tight. You are live. You are speaking to every American ship in the galaxy. Gideon stepped up to the primary broadcast module. He did not have a speech prepared. He did not need one. He had carried these words in his chest for 40 years. This is Gideon Thorne, commanding the United States Space Command, Dreadnought Alamo. His voice carried across the void. It echoed in the pristine, silent hallways of orbital defense stations. It crackled over the grease-stained speakers of deep space mining rigs. It played through the intercoms of luxury starliners and the bleak, armored corridors of maximum security prison barges. 40 years ago, a Valkyrie captain found an American survey ship dying in the dark. He was ordered to leave them. He was ordered to watch them burn. He refused. He dragged 12 of our people out of the fire. He ruined his own life to do it. Gideon paused. He let the weight of the history settle over the minds of a million listeners. My mother was the commander of that ship. She made a promise. She said that humanity pays its debts. She said that if they ever called, we would come. He looked down at the tactical display showing the blinking desperate beacon from Valkyrie Prime. Today they called. The Valkyrie are being exterminated by the Krell Empire. The politicians in Washington have ordered the fleet to stand down. They say it is too dangerous. They say it is not our fight. They say we have no obligation. Gideon gripped the edges of the console. His knuckles turned white. They are wrong. We have the only obligation that matters. We gave our word. I am taking the Alamo to Valkyrie Prime. I am going to brace the perimeter. The Krell are massive. They are brutal. The mathematics of this engagement are terrible. I am not giving an order today. I am giving a choice. If you believe that an American promise means something, then I will see you in the dark. Thorne out. He cut the channel. The Alamo sat in the black void of space. The silence returned heavier now. Gideon looked at his navigation officer. Spool up the slip space drive. Plot a direct course for Valkyrie Prime. Sir, the navigation officer said softly, we are one ship. I know, Gideon said. He picked up his chipped mug of cold coffee. He took a drink. It tasted like ash. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. The Alamo charged its drives, a solitary giant, preparing to walk into a graveyard. The tactical map remained empty. The Pentagon was screaming over the secure channels, threatening to launch interceptors, threatening to blow the Alamo out of the sky before it could jump. Gideon ignored them. Then a green light blinked on the communications board. Audio only, the lieutenant whispered. Put it through. A heavy, gravelly voice accompanied by the grinding sound of heavy machinery filled the bridge. Admiral Thorne, this is Captain Miller of the commercial mining rig Deep Core 7. We are currently hauling 4 million tons of unrefined iron ore from the asteroid belt. Gideon closed his eyes. Captain Miller, you are a civilian vessel. Yeah, well, Miller grunted. My grandfather was a mechanic on the Pioneer. He met my grandmother 2 years after he got back. I wouldn't be breathing this recycled air if it wasn't for that green bastard who pulled him out of the reactor room. We just dumped our cargo. 4 million tons of iron gone. We are redirecting our fusion drives. We have industrial lasers that can slice a moon in half. We are spooling up. We will see you in the dark, Admiral. The channel clicked off. Before Gideon could speak, another light blinked. Then 3 more. Then 20. This is the medical frigate Mercy. We are overriding corporate mandates. We have 2,000 trauma beds and enough synthetic blood to float a battleship. Plotting course now. This is Commander Hayes' destroyer USS Vengeance. My crew just locked the political officer in the mess hall. Weapons are hot. We are on your wing, Alamo. The board lit up. It was not a trickle. It was a flood. It was an avalanche of green lights, hundreds of them, thousands of them. It was the voice of the American working class. It was the voice of veterans. It was the voice of people who built their lives on the concept of honor, rejecting the cold calculus of the politicians. A voice came through, smooth and eerily calm. Admiral, this is Warden Graves of the maximum security transport ship Tartarus. I have 5,000 inmates serving life sentences for murder, piracy, and treason. I played them your message. They took a vote. Gideon frowned. Warden, your ship is a flying fortress, but it is unarmed. We have heavy mass, Admiral, the warden said, his voice carrying a grim smile. And the boys down in Cell Block D want to know what happens when 300,000 tons of reinforced tungsten rams a Krell dreadnought at light speed. We are locked and loaded. See you in hell, Admiral. Gideon looked at the tactical map. It was no longer empty. The space around the Alamo was swarming with slipspace signatures. The entire sector was lighting up like a wildfire. Launch, Gideon ordered. The fabric of space tore open and the American fleet stepped into the void. Millions of light years away, Zyra clawed her way out of the rubble. Her hands were bleeding. Her scales were cracked. The air was so thick with smoke she could barely see the sky. But she could hear the engines. She dragged herself over the shattered concrete of the communications relay. She looked up toward the northern horizon. The refugee ships were launching. They were massive, slow, cumbersome vessels. They had no weapons. They had no heavy armor. They were designed to carry tens of thousands of Valkyrie civilians. They were rising from the burning surface of the planet, struggling against gravity, pushing toward the upper atmosphere. Zyra felt a momentary surge of hope. They were getting away. The children, the elders, they were making it to the stars. In high orbit, Warlord Morvath sat on his command throne. He swirled a goblet of thick, dark wine. He watched the tactical display. He watched the Valkyrie refugee fleet break the atmosphere. Are they clear of the gravity well? Morvath asked, his voice a low rumble of amusement. Yes, Warlord, his tactical officer replied. They are approaching the edge of the system. They believe they have escaped. Morvath smiled. It was a terrifying expression. Activate the net. In the silent dark space just beyond the orbit of Valkyrie Prime, 1,000,000 invisible mechanisms snapped awake. The Krell had not left the escape route open out of incompetence. They had left it open out of cruelty. They had seeded the high orbit with magnetic disruption mines. The mines did not explode. They emitted a targeted electromagnetic pulse that instantly fried the unshielded engines of the Valkyrie colony ships. From the surface, Zyra watched in horror as the rising silver teardrops suddenly stopped. Their engines died. The brilliant blue thrust of their rockets vanished. The ships hung in the air for a terrible, agonizing second. Then, caught by the relentless grip of the planet's gravity, they began to fall. They were helpless. They were trapped in the high atmosphere, slowly sinking back down into the fire. "Bring the main plasma batteries online," Morvath ordered, setting down his goblet. "Target the falling ships. I want the people on the surface to watch them burn. I want them to know that hope is a disease and the Krell are the cure." The Krell dreadnoughts shifted their massive forms. The armored plating along their hulls retracted, revealing the glowing, sun-hot barrels of their primary weapons. The energy buildup was so intense, it distorted the light around the ships. "3 minutes to maximum charge," the tactical officer announced. "Let them look at the stars one last time," Morvath said. Zyra fell to her knees. She felt the vibrations of the charging Krell weapons in her teeth. It was over. Her grandfather's sacrifice, her desperate run through the burning city, the ancient silver cylinder. It had all been for nothing. The universe was exactly what the Krell said it was, a slaughterhouse. She closed her eyes. She waited for the flash of plasma that would vaporize her world. 2 minutes to firing sequence," the Krell officer droned. Morvath leaned forward, his eyes hungry for the destruction. "Warlord!" A new voice broke the discipline of the Krell bridge. It was the sensor operator. His voice was laced with something the Krell rarely experienced: confusion. "Report," Morvath snapped. "Spatial anomalies detected." The operator set, his hands flying across his console. "Massive gravitational distortions on the edge of the system." "Asteroids," Morvath asked dismissively. "No, Warlord. It is a slip space rupture." "Then blow whatever comes out of it to dust." "Warlord, you do not understand. It is not a rupture. It is hundreds of ruptures." Morvath stood up. The tactical display in the center of the bridge suddenly filled with aggressive, rapidly expanding red icons. They were not approaching in a standard military formation. They were not employing stealth protocols. They were tearing into the system like a pack of starving wolves. The fabric of space rippled, and then it shattered. The United States Space Command dreadnought Alamo dropped out of hyperspace. It was a leviathan of dark gray titanium bristling with railguns and missile pods. It did not decelerate. It maintained combat speed, a spearhead aimed directly at the heart of the Krell blockade. But the Alamo was not alone. Space folded and snapped behind it. Sleek angular destroyers, heavy cruisers with their weapon bays already open. And then came the civilians. Morvath stared in absolute disbelief as the pristine, deadly lines of his armada were suddenly confronted by a chaotic, jagged wall of industrial machinery. Massive ore haulers covered in rust and cosmic dust, their fusion drives burning with unstable fury. Medical frigates painted bright white, completely unarmored, accelerating straight toward the Krell guns. Cargo freighters, salvage tugs, even a massive, blocky prison transport ship. "What is this garbage?" Morvath roared. "Identify them!" The sensor operator was sweating. The environmental controls on the Krell bridge could not compensate for his sudden panic. "Warlord, they are broadcasting a unified signal on all frequencies. It is overpowering our internal comms." "Play it." The bridge of the Krell dreadnought filled with a single repeating phrase. It was spoken in English, translated by the Krell computers into their harsh, guttural tongue. But the meaning required no translation. The tone was absolute. "We remember. We remember. We remember." "They are locking weapons," the tactical officer screamed. "All of them, even the civilian ships. They are painting us with targeting lasers." Morvath felt a cold spike of adrenaline. He had fought the disciplined fleets of the Galactic Corps. He had fought the fanatical warrior cults of the Outer Rim. He knew how to fight soldiers. But this was not an army. This was an entire species throwing itself into the fire out of pure, unadulterated spite and loyalty. "Shift the main batteries," Morvath yelled, his composure shattering. "Target the lead dreadnought fire." The Krell plasma cannons meant to execute the helpless Valkyrie refugees fired into the void. Sun-hot beams of concentrated energy lashed out, striking the shields of the Alamo. The American dreadnought shuddered violently, its forward plating instantly glowing white-hot. But the Alamo did not stop. It did not alter course. Gideon Thorne stood on his burning bridge. Sparks rained down around him. He did not blink. "All ships," Gideon ordered, his voice echoing across the chaotic American fleet. "The Krell have locked the refugees in high orbit. The enemy shields are heavy. Our standard munitions will bounce off them." He looked at the massive, arrogant Krell dreadnought filling his viewport. "We do not have time for strategy," Gideon said. "We do not have time for finesse. Break their line. Break it now." Captain Miller of the mining rig Deep Core 7 grabbed his comms. "You heard the Admiral," Miller barked to his crew of roughnecks. "We are not carrying ore today. We are carrying a grudge. Full burn on the fusion drives. Lasers. Lock the steering thrusters." The massive mining rig, a 3 million ton brick of reinforced steel designed to crack asteroids, accelerated. It did not fire a weapon. It became the weapon. Morvath watched the tactical display in horror as the lumbering industrial ship ignored the frantic laser fire of his perimeter defense frigates. The Krell lasers carved deep molten trenches into the hull of the mining rig, blowing away entire decks. But the rig had no critical systems in its outer shell. It was just mass. Unstoppable, furious mass. "Evasive maneuvers," Morvath screamed at his helmsman. It was too late. The Deep Core 7 slammed into the flank of a Krell heavy cruiser. There was no explosion, only the terrifying grinding shriek of metal tearing metal in the vacuum of space. The kinetic impact was so massive, it snapped the spine of the Krell warship. The cruiser tumbled out of formation, its reactors breaching, dying in a silent, expanding sphere of blue fire. The line was broken. The American fleet poured through the gap. The destroyers unleashed swarms of depleted uranium missiles, overwhelming the Krell point defense cannons. The chaotic mix of military and civilian vessels created a tactical nightmare for the Krell targeting computers. They were designed to predict fleet maneuvers, not the suicidal, instinctual brawling of a mining crew or the reckless charge of a prison ship. Down on the surface of Valkyrie Prime, Zyra opened her eyes. She looked up. The sky was no longer falling. The stars were returning. She saw the bright, terrible flashes of the battle raging in orbit. She saw the debris of Krell warships burning up as they hit the atmosphere, falling like meteorites. And she saw the Valkyrie colony ships. They were no longer sinking. They were surrounded by a swarm of small white ships with red crosses painted on their hulls. The American medical frigates had driven straight through the Krell crossfire, locking their own tractors onto the dying Valkyrie vessels, physically dragging them out of the gravity well and shielding them from the plasma fire with their own unarmored hulls. "They came," Zyra whispered. The tears that fell from her eyes were no longer of despair. Deep underground, leaning on his cane, Kalen felt the shock waves of the orbital battle. He did not need to see it to know what was happening. He felt a deep, profound warmth spread through his ancient, weary bones. He closed his eyes and saw the face of the human woman from 40 years ago. She had not lied. In the heart of the slaughter, the USSC Alamo was bleeding. Gideon Thorne held onto the command console as another Krell plasma volley stripped away the last of the ship's forward armor. The port side engine was gone. The atmospheric scrubbers were failing. The bridge smelled of burned copper and vaporized coolant. "Sir," the flag lieutenant shouted over the din of the alarms, "we have lost structural integrity on decks 4 through 9. We are taking heavy casualties. The Krell flagship is locking its primary batteries on us. We cannot take another hit." Gideon looked at the Krell dreadnought. It was vast. It was unbroken. He knew the cost of this day. He had known it when he unpinned his stars. He had known it when he asked his people to follow him. He reached for the ship-wide intercom. He had to give the order to abandon the lower decks. He had to prepare his crew for the end. But before he could speak, the tactical display shifted. 3 ships broke formation from the chaotic, swirling dogfight. They were not military. One was a deep space cargo hauler. One was an atmospheric water skimmer. The third was a passenger liner, its luxury observation decks shattered and dark. They did not answer Gideon's hails. They ignored the frantic orders to pull back. They accelerated directly into the space between the Alamo and the Krell flagship. They cut their engines. They aligned their hulls side by side. "What are they doing?" "Well," the lieutenant breathed, his eyes wide. Gideon felt his chest tighten, a physical ache sharper than any wound he had ever taken. "They are building a wall," Gideon said softly. The Krell flagship fired. A beam of pure annihilating energy, the width of a city block, tore across the void. It was meant to vaporize the Alamo to kill the American admiral and break the spirit of the fleet. It struck the passenger liner first. The unarmored civilian ship disintegrated instantly, its titanium bones flashing into vapor. But the mass of the ship diffused the beam. The scattered plasma washed over the cargo hauler, melting its hull into slag, turning it into a burning molten shield. The water skimmer took the last of the thermal shockwave, detonating violently. The shockwave slammed into the Alamo, throwing Gideon to the deck. The lights flickered and died. Emergency power kicked in. Gideon pulled himself up from the floor. He wiped blood from his forehead. He looked out the shattered viewport. The three civilian ships were gone, reduced to a cloud of burning dust and twisted metal. But the Alamo remained. They had held the line. They had paid the peace in blood and iron so their admiral could live. Gideon Thorne stood tall. The cold, calculated military logic that had defined his life was gone. It was replaced by a roaring, incandescent fury, a pride so deep it touched the marrow of his bones. This was America. This was the messy, chaotic, beautiful, terrifying reality of a people who did not know how to bow. He turned to his weapons officer. The man was bleeding from a shrapnel wound to his shoulder, but his hands were locked onto the firing controls. "Target the Krell flagship," Gideon commanded. His voice was the sound of a mountain cracking. "Divert all remaining power from life support. Divert the emergency reserves. I want every railgun, every missile, every ounce of kinetic energy we have left put into the center of that monster." "Sir," the engineering officer called out, "if we drop life support, we have 10 minutes of air." "Then we kill them in night awe," Gideon replied. The Alamo shuddered. It was a dying ship, but it had teeth, and as the Alamo prepared to strike its final blow, the rest of the American fleet, witnessing the sacrifice of the civilian ships, went utterly, completely berserk. The warden of the Tartarus, his ship already burning, drove his prison barge straight into the engine block of a Krell destroyer, taking both ships down in a blinding flash. The mining rigs activated their tethering harpoons, latching onto Krell frigates and dragging them into each other's line of fire. The disciplined, arrogant Krell Empire was not fighting a navy. They were fighting a barroom brawl in the middle of a burning house, and the Krell were losing. Morvath watched his invincible armada fracture and bleed. He saw the sheer suicidal ferocity of the humans. He realized with a cold, sickening dread that they would not stop. They would not surrender. They would grind his fleet into dust, even if it meant destroying themselves in the process. They were not fighting for territory. They were not fighting for resources. They were fighting for a promise, and a promise could not be killed. Morvath looked at his tactical officer. The officer was trembling. "Order the retreat," Morvath whispered. His voice was hollow. The arrogance was gone. "Break off the engagement. Get us out of this system." The Krell flagship turned. It engaged its hyperspace engines, abandoning its dying escort ships. It fled into the void, leaving behind a graveyard of shattered iron and broken pride. The Battle of Valkyrie Prime was over. The silence returned to the void. It was a heavy, bloody silence. On the bridge of the Alamo, Gideon Thorne leaned heavily against his console. The red emergency lights bathed the deck. His crew was bleeding. His ship was dying. He looked at the tactical display. 43 American ships had been lost. 43 crews. Thousands of lives. He looked up at the viewport. Beyond the burning debris of the Krell fleet, the Valkyrie colony ships hung safely in the stars, shielded by the battered hulls of the American medical frigates. The dark had closed in, but they had held the line. "Admiral," the flag lieutenant said, his voice thick with emotion. "We have a transmission from the surface." Gideon wiped the blood from his eyes. "Put it through." The screen flickered. The face of an ancient Valkyrie appeared. His scales were gray. His eyes were clouded. But he stood tall, leaning on a wooden cane. Gideon recognized him from the old files. "Captain Kalen," Gideon said, his voice a hoarse whisper. The old alien looked at the battered, bleeding human admiral. He looked at the wreckage of the fleet that had crossed the galaxy to save a world that was not their own. "You came," Kalen said. His voice broke. "You actually came." Gideon Thorne straightened his back. He ignored the pain in his ribs. He looked the alien in the eye. "My mother sends her regards, Captain," Gideon said. "The debt is paid. You are under the protection of the United States of America. Nobody touches you ever again." Kalen closed his eyes, and for the first time in 40 years, the old Valkyrie wept. The guns went silent. The thrusters died. The void reclaimed its quiet. Above the burning atmosphere of Valkyrie Prime, the orbit was no longer a pristine vacuum. It was a graveyard of shattered empires. Millions of tons of jagged, superheated metal drifted aimlessly in the zero-gravity cold. The colossal blackened ribs of Krell dreadnoughts floated alongside the sleek white debris of American medical frigates and the heavy rusted tungsten plates of civilian ore haulers. Frozen clouds of oxygen and vaporized engine coolant hung in the black like nebula dust. On the bridge of the United States Space Command dreadnought Alamo, Admiral Gideon Thorne stood like a statue carved from ash and bruised iron. The main viewport was a spider web of deep structural cracks. The air was thin, carrying the acrid chemical bite of discharged munitions and the heavy metallic stench of fresh blood. The red emergency strobes painted the faces of his surviving bridge crew. They were battered, they were bleeding, they were utterly exhausted. But they were alive, and they had stood their ground. "Damage report," Gideon said. His voice was a gravelly rasp, stripped of all its commanding thunder, reduced to the raw mechanics of survival. "Primary reactors are offline, Admiral," the engineering officer replied, coughing into a soot-stained rag. "We are running on auxiliary batteries. Hull integrity is compromised on 30% of our lower decks. Life support is stable, but we have massive atmospheric venting in sections 4 through 9. Triage teams are mobilizing." Gideon looked at the master tactical display. The massive red icons of the Krell Armada were gone, fled into the deep black. In their place were the blinking, erratic green lights of the surviving American fleet. "The fleet," Gideon demanded. "Give me the numbers." The flag lieutenant swallowed hard. His hands shook as he manipulated the cracked glass of his console. He didn't want to read the numbers. He didn't want to make it real. "Admiral, we have confirmed the total destruction of 43 American vessels, 6 military destroyers, 12 heavy cruisers, 25 civilian craft." The lieutenant's voice cracked. "The Tartarus is gone. The Starlight Voyager is gone. The Deep Core 7 Captain Smiller's rig, it is just a debris field, sir. No escape pods detected." Gideon closed his eyes. 43 ships, 14,000 American lives. Men and women who had woken up this morning with families, with futures, with cargo to haul, and patrols to run. They had taken his call. They had followed him into the mouth of hell, and they had paid the ultimate price. The silence on the bridge was deafening. It was not the silence of victory. It was the silence of a funeral. "And the Valkyrie?" Gideon asked, opening his eyes. He forced himself to look at the blue and green sphere of the planet below. "The colony ships are secure," the sensor operator reported, wiping a mixture of sweat and blood from his brow. "The USS Mercy and the remaining medical frigates have locked them into a protective perimeter. The Krell blockade is completely broken. The planetary bombardment has ceased. The Valkyrie, they are safe, sir." Gideon nodded slowly. The heavy, suffocating weight in his chest did not lift, but it shifted. It solidified into a grim, unyielding pride. "Open a fleet-wide channel," Gideon ordered. The lieutenant engaged the comms. The channel hissed with static, connecting the battered remnants of the American Armada. "This is Admiral Thorne," Gideon said. He did not yell. He spoke softly, letting the microphone carry the weight of his words into the ruined corridors of every surviving ship. "Stand down from combat alert. The enemy has retreated. The perimeter held. Secure your bulkheads, tend to your wounded, and initiate search and rescue protocols in the debris field. We leave no one behind in the void." He paused. He looked out at the floating graveyard. "You did not have to come," Gideon continued, his voice thick with a raw, undeniable emotion. "Washington told you to stay home. Logic told you to run, but you came. You looked into the fire, and you chose to stand between the innocent and the monsters. You proved what this uniform, what that flag actually means. I have never been prouder to serve with anyone." "Thorne out?" He cut the channel. He turned to his helmsman. "Prepare my dropship," Gideon commanded. "I am going down to the surface." "Admiral, you are wounded." the medical officer protested, stepping forward with a trauma kit. You have shrapnel in your shoulder and 2 broken ribs. You need to be in a suspension bed. Patch it, tape it, and give me a painkiller, Gideon growled, shrugging off his ruined uniform jacket. My mother made a promise to a man on that rock 40 years ago. I'm going to look him in the eye and tell him the debt is paid. The descent through the atmosphere of Valkyrie Prime was a journey through a dying sky. The clouds were stained a sickly, bruised purple from the Krell plasma bombardment. Ash fell like black snow, coating the viewport of the armored Marine dropship. Gideon stood in the troop bay, gripping the overhead stabilization bar. Below him, the capital city of the Valkyrie was a sprawling landscape of shattered crystalline spires and burning rubble. It looked like the end of the world. The dropship flared its retro thrusters, kicking up a massive cloud of soot as it touched down in the center of a ruined plaza. The heavy hydraulic ramp lowered with a mechanical groan, hitting the cracked pavement with a heavy thud. Gideon stepped out into the ash. The air was hot, smelling of melted glass and oxidized metal. He was flanked by a squad of Marine Force recon soldiers in full combat exosuits, their heavy pulse rifles lowered but ready. But there was no enemy left to fight. The plaza was filled with Valkyrie, thousands of them. They were covered in dust, bleeding, their green scales dull with shock and terror. They were gathered in the ruins of their civilization, clutching their children, staring in absolute stunned silence at the giant metal machines falling from the sky. More American dropships were landing around the perimeter, but they were not deploying infantry to conquer. The ramps dropped and the rough blue-collar workers of the surviving mining rigs poured out. They didn't wear crisp uniforms. They wore heavy, grease-stained environmental suits. They carried hydraulic jacks, plasma-cutting torches, and heavy lifting harnesses. Following them were the medics from the USS Mercy, dressed in stark white, pushing anti-grav trauma stretchers and carrying crates of synthetic blood and cellular regenerators. Gideon watched as a massive bearded human miner from an asteroid rig walked up to a collapsed building. He didn't speak the Valkyrie language. He didn't need to. He saw a green-scaled arm reaching out from under a 10-ton block of ferrocrete. The miner activated his shoulder-mounted plasma cutter, sliced through the rebar, and used his exosuit to heave the concrete slab off the trapped alien. The miner reached down, offering a thick, calloused human hand to the terrified Valkyrie civilian. The alien took it. The human pulled him up, slapped him gently on the shoulder, and yelled for a medic. It was happening everywhere. The sheer, overwhelming machinery of American industrial and military might had pivoted in an instant from total war to absolute rescue. The humans moved with a terrifying, efficient urgency. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't wait for a planetary governor to organize them. They just saw broken things and they went to work fixing them. The Valkyrie crowd in the plaza parted as Gideon Thorne walked forward. He was a towering figure, his dark blue uniform stained with hydrogen blood, his left arm strapped tight to his chest with medical tape. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a wounded lion. The alien civilians looked at him with a mixture of absolute awe and sheer terror. They had just watched his fleet tear the invincible Krell Empire to shreds. At the far end of the plaza, standing before the shattered remains of a planetary fountain, a small group of Valkyrie waited. In the center of the group was Zyra. Her emerald scales were scarred, her clothes torn. Next to her, leaning heavily on a carved wooden cane, was Kalen. The old Valkyrie captain looked at the human admiral walking through the ashes of his world. He saw the gray hair, the hard-weathered lines around the eyes, the unmistakable posture of command. He saw the ghost of the young female commander he had pulled from a radioactive fire 40 years ago. Gideon stopped 10 feet away. The Marine escort fanned out, creating a secure perimeter, but Gideon raised his good hand, ordering them to lower their weapons completely. The silence between the two men stretched. It was a silence earned through blood and decades of waiting. Admiral Thorne, Kalen said. His translator device clicked, turning his raspy, clicking language into flat English. But the emotion in his golden eyes required no translation. Captain Kalen, Gideon replied. His voice was rough, carrying the exhaustion of the battle. Kalen leaned forward on his cane. His hands were shaking. When my granddaughter sent the signal, I told her it was a fool's errand. I told her that empires do not remember the kindness of ghosts. I told her that humans were too far away and the Krell were too strong. Kalen looked up at the sky, where the American dropships were still pouring through the clouds bringing food, medicine, and salvation. I was an old, cynical fool, Kalen whispered. You tore the heavens apart for us. Why? Gideon reached out. Zyra stepped forward, her hands trembling. She uncurled her fingers. Resting in her palm was the small silver cylinder. She had refused to let it go when the American miners dug her out of the collapsed relay station. Gideon gently took the tarnished silver recorder from the young alien's hand. He stepped forward and pressed it into Kalen's trembling, scaled grip. 40 years ago, Gideon said, his voice echoing across the quiet plaza. You looked at a crippled American ship. You knew the rules of your government. You knew it would cost you your career, your honor, and your freedom. But you looked at my mother and you chose mercy over politics. You chose to be a protector. Gideon met the alien's gaze directly. My mother told you that humanity pays its debts. Gideon continued, his jaw tightening. We are not a perfect people, Captain. We argue. We fight. We make terrible mistakes. But if there is one thing woven into the DNA of every American sailor, soldier, and citizen, it is that we do not break our word. You bled for us. Today, we bled for you. The ledger is clean. The debt is paid in full. Kalen looked down at the silver cylinder in his hand. A single heavy tear rolled down his scaly cheek, dropping onto the ash-covered pavement. You lost so many, Kalen said, his voice breaking. I monitored the fleet telemetry before the relay collapsed. I saw the civilian ships, the freighters, the liners. They threw themselves into the plasma fire to shield our colony vessels. They were not soldiers. They did not have to die. They chose to, Gideon said firmly, because that is what we do. We do not ask if the odds are fair. We do not ask if the fight is easy. We look at the innocent, we look at the monsters in the void, and we draw a line. Zyra stepped forward. She looked at the giant human admiral. How can we ever repay this? Gideon looked at her. A faint, sad smile touched the corner of his mouth. You do not. You live. You rebuild your world. And if you ever see someone drowning in the dark, you reach out your hand and pull them up. That is the only repayment we accept. While Gideon stood in the ashes of Valkyrie Prime, a very different kind of storm was breaking on Earth. In the subterranean war room of the Pentagon, Secretary of Defense Vance sat at the head of the polished mahogany table. The room was dead silent. The massive holographic displays on the walls were playing the tactical sensor logs recovered from the Alamo. They watched the Krell Armada break. They watched Captain Miller's mining rig tear a Krell cruiser in half. They watched the unarmored civilian ships form a wall of flesh and steel to protect the Alamo. Vance's face was the color of old parchment. He had drafted the court-martial orders for Admiral Thorne. He had prepared the press releases condemning the rogue actions of the fleet. He had been ready to sacrifice Gideon Thorne on the altar of diplomatic stability. But the footage had leaked. A communications officer on the Alamo had bypassed the military censors and broadcast the unencrypted battle logs directly to the civilian news networks on Earth. The entire planet was watching. They were not watching a military blunder. They were watching the greatest display of unified human courage in the history of the species. They saw the names of the fallen civilian ships scrolling across the bottom of the news feeds. They saw the miners, the doctors, the wardens fighting and dying for an alien race they had never met simply to uphold an American promise. An aide burst into the war room. He looked terrified. Mr. Secretary, the aide stammered, the White House is on line 1, the president. Vance closed his eyes. He knew what was coming. And sir, the aide added, his voice dropping, there are tens of thousands of people gathering outside the Pentagon. Spontaneous demonstrations. They are carrying signs with the names of the lost ships. They are demanding that the Krell Empire be classified as a hostile entity. They are demanding that we secure Valkyrie space. Vance looked at the frozen image on the screen. It was Admiral Thorne bleeding, standing on the bridge of his dying ship, keeping the wall. Vance realized with a crushing sense of historical irrelevance that he had been completely outmaneuvered. Not by strategy, not by politics, but by the sheer terrifying moral weight of a man who believed in doing the right thing. Tell the president, Vance said quietly, that the Department of Defense is fully authorizing the deployment of the 1st and 2nd Engineering Fleets to Valkyrie Prime. We are initiating a planetary reconstruction effort, and tell him I will have my letter of resignation on his desk by morning. Vance stood up, straightening his tie. He looked at the men around the table. We tried to play it safe, Vance said bitterly. And Thorne just reminded the galaxy that humanity is a lot of things, but we are not safe. 3 days later, the fires on Valkyrie Prime had been extinguished. The skies were beginning to clear. The massive reconstruction effort was already underway, fueled by the relentless energy of the American engineering battalions. But before the real work could begin, there was a debt of grief that had to be paid. The memorial service was held in the high orbit above the planet amidst the floating wreckage of the battle. The USSC Alamo, heavily patched and limping on auxiliary power, served as the command center for the ceremony. Surrounding it were the surviving ships of the American fleet, alongside the fragile, beautiful Valkyrie colony ships that had been saved. Gideon Thorne stood on the observation deck of the Alamo. He was in his dress blues. The silver stars were pinned back onto his collar. He had not asked for them back. The crew had retrieved them from the bridge console and pinned them on his uniform while he slept in the medical bay. They were not political symbols anymore. They were badges of honor. Beside him stood Captain Kalen and Zyra, wearing the ceremonial robes of their people. The ship's intercom clicked on. The chaplain of the fleet, a gray-haired Navy veteran, stepped to the microphone. "We gather today in the quiet of the void," the chaplain's voice echoed across the comms of thousands of ships. "We gather to honor the men and women who did not return. We gather to remember the 43 vessels that held the line." A low, resonant bell began to toll. It was a digital construct broadcasting on all frequencies, but it sounded like deep, heavy brass. The chaplain began to read the names. United States Space Command Destroyer Vengeance. Dong. Commercial Mining Rig Deep Core 7. Captain Miller and his crew of 112. Dong. Maximum Security Transport Tartarus. Warden Graves and 5,000 souls. Dong. Civilian passenger liner Starlight Voyager. As each name was read, a single flare was fired from the Alamo into the debris field. The flares burned bright magnesium white, casting long, haunting shadows across the shattered hulls of the Krell dreadnoughts and the twisted metal of the American ships. Gideon stood at rigid attention. His jaw was locked. He did not blink. He stared into the graveyard of his fleet, committing every piece of broken iron to memory. Kalen watched the human admiral. The old Valkyrie understood now. He understood the terrifying dichotomy of humanity. They were a species that could build weapons capable of cracking planets, yet they would weep for the loss of a stranger. They were chaotic, loud, and prone to anger, but when the shadows closed in, they possessed a capacity for self-sacrifice that defied all biological logic. The Valkyrie did not have a military salute. But as the last name was read, Kalen placed his hand over his heart and bowed his head deeply. Across the Valkyrie fleet, hundreds of thousands of aliens did the same, a gesture of absolute reverence for the monsters who had become their saviors. The reading of the names finished. The silence returned. Gideon stepped to the microphone. "They are gone," Gideon said. His voice was steady, projecting across the fleet and down to the planet below. "But they are not lost. They are woven into the fabric of this system. Their iron is your iron. Their blood is your blood." He looked at the tactical display, knowing that the transmission was not just staying local. American intelligence had ensured that this broadcast was being pushed out across the hyperspace relay network. It was being sent to the galactic core. It was being sent to the remnants of the Krell Empire. It was a message to the universe. "Let it be known," Gideon proclaimed, his voice hardening into steel. "Let every empire, every warlord, every sovereign system hear this and understand. The Valkyrie people are under the absolute protection of the United States of America. We are building the permanent orbital defense station in this sector. We are leaving the First Fleet to stand guard." Gideon leaned closer to the microphone. "If you look at this world and see weakness," Gideon warned, "if you look at this world and see prey, understand what awaits you. We do not fight for conquest. We do not fight for profit. We fight for our friends. And if you touch them, if you threaten them, we will not negotiate. We will not hesitate. We will cross the void, and we will break your empires into dust." He stepped back. The transmission ended. The promise was made. Years passed. The galaxy is a vast, ancient, and unforgiving place. Empires rise and empires fall. The Krell Empire shattered by the loss of their invincible armada, and terrified of a human counterattack fractured into civil war and collapsed inward. But Valkyrie Prime thrived. The ruined cities were rebuilt stronger and more beautiful than before, merging Valkyrie crystalline architecture with heavy utilitarian American steel. In the center of the Capitol Plaza, they built a monument, not a statue of a politician, not an abstract piece of art. It was the shattered blackened nose cone of a civilian mining rig recovered from orbit, Deep Core 7. Beneath it, carved into a slab of obsidian, were the names of the 43 human ships. And in orbit, casting a long protective shadow over the planet, was the massive Joint Defense Station. It was manned by human Marines and Valkyrie technicians, standing shoulder to shoulder watching the deep radar scans for any sign of trouble. But trouble never came. The story had spread. It had moved through the hyperspace lanes, whispered in the trading hubs of the Outer Rim, debated in the grand halls of the core worlds. The story of the terrifying, illogical, fiercely loyal apes from Sol 3. A young alien trader sitting in a cantina on a border world, 1,000 light years from Earth, watched a newsfeed showing a human cargo ship docking peacefully with a Valkyrie frigate. "I do not understand them," the alien trader muttered to his companion. "They are completely unpredictable. They have no grand strategy. Why does everyone give Terran ships such a wide berth?" His companion, an older, scarred veteran of the border wars, took a sip of his drink. He looked at the human ship on the screen. "Because," the old veteran said quietly, "you never know who they owe a favor to." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a cautious whisper. "The rule is simple, kid. You can insult their politicians. You can outtrade their merchants. You can even win a border skirmish against their patrols if you are lucky. But if you see a human and they tell you that a certain species or a certain planet is under their protection." The veteran shook his head. "You walk away. You do not ask questions. You just walk away. Because the universe learned a very hard lesson at Valkyrie Prime." The young trader frowned. "What lesson?" The old veteran looked out the window of the cantina, staring into the infinite black of space. "When you call for help, most of the galaxy will ignore you," he said. "They will calculate the risk. They will consult their laws. But the humans do not care about the odds." He looked back at the younger alien. "When you call," he said softly, "humans will come. Always."